In this episode, when is architecture not parametric? A look at the dangers and the advantages. Welcome to Two Architects and a Lawyer. Join architect Luis de Miguel in Valencia and architect lawyer William McLean in Vancouver for observations and commentary on all things design. Here are William and Luis.
Hello, William. How are you doing today? You seem to be out of that basement. Ooh.
New location, Louis. I'm doing this recording from our chalet in Lac-Manitou, Quebec, which is about an hour and a half north of Montreal. Spring hasn't quite arrived here yet, but it will be around shortly, I'm hoping. What are we going to talk about today?
Well, we're going to talk about labeling and particularly parametric architecture as we know it. Okay. Well, seems to me we like to label things in our society, and certainly architecture is no exception. So something called parametric architecture seems to have taken hold lately after we've had things like deconstructivism, of course, postmodernism, and international style, and so on. And it seems to be a constant. It's like flaring jeans, and then the bell bottoms became cigarette bottoms and very thin. So, I thought it'd be interesting to look at this parametric architecture.
Well, the title of our episode is When is Architecture Not Parametric? And I suppose before we can get into that, we have to define it as best we can so we can find out what is and isn't parametric. Is a basic definition that you would accept is that it has to do with algorithms, with relationships between changing variables in a computer program to create design? Is that essentially what drives parametricism?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, the fact that we're using artificial intelligence now for everything has enlightened more or has made this parametric notion take hold. Like you say, variables, different considerations, and so on. Now, this is something that clearly all architects have done from day one, is use parameters, whether we were using computers or not. But in any case, for the purposes of the discussion today, it's, para means around or above, and metric means to measure. So it has to do with measurements, variables, considerations, etc. And of course, computers are very good at handling this sort of thing and providing different solutions and so on, which is a wonderful thing. But it's something that we've done since day one. I mean, I think that the typical example that comes around when you talk about parametric architecture is Zaha Hadid, who's this terminal building or this building that looks a bit like the TWA terminal at JFK Airport, is the apex of parametric building.
From the public's point of view, is parametric just if they see crazy curves, blobs, futuristic grids, that means parametric? Is that what the public will understand? And is that different than what architects understand parametricism to mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, because I mean, that type of building, that kind of solution to a problem, to a building problem, was really too difficult to achieve before computers came around and before artificial intelligence came around. So, yes, I think that's simply because it is a strange shape that it goes beyond what Frank Gehry was doing. So, yes, but I thought we'd look at just, how does an architect go about designing a building? And the site plan is the first drawing that comes out, and because you have to limit, and you have literally parameters, perhaps parametric, but parameters of the size of the site, the orientation, the setbacks, the zoning, the FAR, all kinds of considerations that you have to take into account when you design a project. And it turns out that there's one software that will do a site plan in 10 minutes. You feed it the information and somehow it makes this drawing. And I have an example of this. You can You can do all kinds of things with it, but I just zeroed in on the site plan because I think it's the easiest thing to understand as to where this parametric architecture comes from. Perhaps a lot of buildings that are these weird shapes are in places where you have more latitude, as it were. But I think it's a good thing to have is to have it would be like having a fantastic draftsman that can do all kinds of solutions very quickly for you. And you can say, well, can you make it so that the sun hits the building only 40% of the time, so that one facade doesn't have to be so heavily insulated, or you can give it all the parameters you want, and the thing will come up with some reasonable. Obviously, it goes beyond site plan. It goes into the design, solving the problem. And if somebody says, well, we're doing an auditorium for 1,500 people, and the client all of a sudden thinks, well, maybe that's not it. The economics are not right, and you have to make it for 3,000 people. So you plug in this other constraint, and another solution comes up. If I were to ask you, what do you think of these type of parametric building? Does does it make sense to you, or you like it?
Well, what's going through my mind is Gothic cathedrals. I'm bringing that up because I was just at Winchester Cathedral recently. It's one of the first of those cathedrals from that era that I have actually experienced. Construction there started 900 years ago. The site was probably just as you're describing. It had unlimited availability. The parameters that were at work in making that building turn out the way it did were gravity and the quality and characteristics of stone. There was also I suppose another parameter was that they wanted the absolute largest interior with the largest height that was possible using that technology. And they worked not through computer systems, but through intuition, trial and error, and so on to come up with the flying buttresses and so on that made that splendor possible. Another big problem with stone buildings was the inability to pierce the walls with large enough windows to make a large interior bright enough to use. So again, that was another parameter that had to be solved through structural means. I'm just raising this to ask you whether you think that is an example of parametric architecture, albeit a primitive and ancient one, or is it something else?
No, I like I said, I think that all architecture is parametric. In fact, the hardest thing to do for an architect is to get a client that comes up. Well, to getting a client's already pretty hard. But let's say a client shows up and says, I want a house. Just draw me a house. Well, you can't. There's nothing. There's the worst thing to have this unlimited freedom, as it were. They don't tell you where it is, where it's looking, how many bedrooms, what kind of life do you lead. Give me some idea what you want. I can't just, make a house like a. If you say make me an apple pie, well, I got pretty much the idea what you want. But a house or a church or an office building, it's not an apple pie. There's no recipe, as it were. There's lots of considerations. So I think it's impossible to design a building that's parameter-less, if that's a word. So, and it's funny because as you were talking about the Gothic cathedral, what I was thinking is, I was thinking about the pyramids in Egypt, where the parameter was not only, amazing logistics, but the thing had to end up pointing exactly to certain stars in the sky. Talk about a parameter with 50-ton stones to boot. So anyway,
Well, you mentioned housing a minute ago, and that's a big leap from the buildings that Zaha Hadid is famous for in scale. And one of the things that happens when you are working at those two different scales is that you have a very different response to the material parameters. In a suburban house subdivision, for example, maybe the 4 by 8 foot dimension of a sheet of plywood is one of the biggest drivers of the final form. That's the most efficient dimension to pay attention to when you're the builder in setting out the dimensions of the house and to a certain extent, its final appearance. When you're Zaha Hadid and you're designing a stadium or a performing arts center where every panel that's applied to that building is manufactured separately and individually, and through CNC control can be customized and so on. Those basic dimensions, like the 4x8 sheet of plywood or the 2x4, stop to have any significance.
Yeah. Well, when Pei designed the extension to the Louvre and he did a pyramid, which was a brilliant idea, because I mean, if you're again talking about another parameter, first you get the phone call. Yeah, they want you to do a bit, an extension to the Louvre. Wow, that's great. The bad news is it's at the Louvre. What are you going to do? I mean, what could you possibly come up with? And for this pyramid thing, I mean, he was absolutely brilliant. 'Cause he didn't have to point to stars or anything. He just had to make the pyramid. There was an amazing amount of research to make it the most transparent. And it sounds funny that you want glass to be very transparent. Glass, as we know, can appear to be extremely opaque. So there was a lot of research into developing glass that was, clear as itself for the pyramid of the Louvre. But, I mean, the constraint of doing something at the Louvre, I mean, it would be like asking to make a suit for Michelangelo's David. I mean, my God, what do you put on this guy? It's, are you adding some? Are you going to make it better in some way? Of course you're not. So what could you possibly add to the Louvre to make it better? Well, this guy did, and of course, he was I am paid. So I leave it at that. I mean, the parameters can be either ridiculous, and in terms, a lot of buildings in New York are stepped back, and it had to do with a zoning regulation that in order to allow more natural light to come down on the street, they would step back the buildings and call them a ziggurat. Of course, they weren't on all sides. It was just the one side. But, that was a constraint that zoning can be more powerful as a design tool than many other.
Yes, well, getting back to that subdivision example I gave a minute ago, probably along with the 4x8 sheet of plywood, it was the zoning and setbacks and town planning constraints that caused those buildings, like Levittown, to appear in the form that they did. You mentioned Gehry, and we seem to be constantly mentioning him in these podcasts. My understanding is that, unlike Zaha Hadid, he didn't use digital tools to realize his buildings, such as Bilbao, for example. They started as physical models or crumpled paper, and then he used computer tools to translate that physical idea that he had into something which was buildable. I'm not sure that's correct or not, but I believe that is the case. He was an early user of the software, but not in the way that subsequent architects have used it.
Yeah, exactly right. It's a fine line, if you like, using the software or AI to design something, as opposed to you design something and then you need the computer to translate that into a buildable documents or documents with which you can build. The jury's a bit out on that whole Gehry computer relationship. I've heard stories that his working drawings were beyond incomplete. The idea that a model would replace, very few contractors can build from a model. They need to know, well, how big is this? And the first thing you stamp on a drawing is the scale is a quarter of an inch equals 1 foot, let's say. And the second line is do not scale drawing. In other words, maybe the scale of the drawing is whatever it is, but I changed my mind at some point and things are not like it says on the mirror. Objects may appear larger than they are or closer than they seem. So, whereas a zoning setback, they ask you for 5 feet, 5 feet. There's very little discussion. But, but drawings are at bit of fiction in a way, not unlike a novel or a film, really. But I don't know. Parametry is something that we. My point is, I don't think we're inventing it. I think that we're just either justifying stuff. I remember at Crits at McGill or even architects that came to lecture at the Alcan series and all that, and they would come up with justification for a lot of things in the building, just like we did as students, why we did certain things. And frankly, it seemed to me very often the justification came after the thought. In other words, you were defending an idea. You were not using the idea to design. You know, you see what I mean?
Well, that's a very useful skill for architecture students to learn because they have to put it to work over and over again in their actual practice, persuading clients that the built form that it's being shown to them in a model or a drawing is in fact the right one for their problem. And the best way to do that is to come up with a descriptive term which catches the non-architect's imagination, the falling water idea, or the bird's nest building, to take a parametric example from the Beijing Olympics, had made it instantly available and accessible to people who otherwise would not have developed any kind of affection for that building at all. It's wonderful when that happens and spontaneously suggests itself during the process.
There's a building in London which people have called the Gherkin, uh, and that's by Foster. There's another one called the Walkie Talkie. People love putting names to buildings, just like they love putting names to movements, particularly the ages. The baby boomers, the Gen X, the Gen Z. We can't help it. We gotta label stuff. Otherwise, you end up having a long explanation as to what you're talking about.
I'm sure that's a natural process in the architect's office, that the team that's working on a project will come up with a pet name, not expecting necessarily that it's going to translate into the real world and be even heard by the client. And little by little, ones they play with and discard are replaced with something which sticks. And sure enough, it ends up being something that catches the public imagination. I think it's a great process. It's very, very helpful to have those names. Let me ask you something about parametric architecture. The fact
Yeah.
that the architecture comes out of software, which is by its definition available to anybody, anywhere in the globe, means that the result is going to look similar in Dubai as it does in New York or Montreal or London. Is that a problem that we are going to be increasingly facing as those local regional variations in design completely disappear? Perhaps it's already
Oh,
happened.
no, not really. A Gothic cathedral could be built in Reims and Chartres or in Burgos, and it was still a Gothic cathedral and pretty much all the same. But i- people disregard parameters, as it were. They want the form. It's like there was in the 80s, every house had to be white with straight lines, very cubic, and it didn't matter really. I mean, you could orient the house and play around how you approached it and that sort of thing, but essentially they were white cubes, and this has become very prevalent around these here parts now as well. Yeah, but I mean, the architect and the client, they're not stupid. You want to have the nice views. You want the pool to aim at the sea if you can do it, that sort of thing. I mean, but ultimately the shape. hmm, I don't think the wind, for instance, prevailing wind is not a big parameter. I mean, the sun, yes. The traffic, the street, yes, yes, normal stuff. You know, but the wind is not always the same. The sun's pretty much always the same. I think in wrapping the thing, I think it's essential to have parameters. I think it's essential, the fear of the blank page when you're writing a book. I mean, you have to, we need limits, otherwise you end up, I mean, can you imagine a whole city just full of this Zaha Hadid stuff with a few Frank Gehry's thrown in for good measure? I mean, it would be, I don't know. You don't want everything to end up
Well,
being the same, do you?
there are two problems there that I see. One is that, and you see this over and over again, certainly in the city where I live, Vancouver, you see buildings which are going up under construction today. You know that they looked, if not gorgeous, then pretty damn nice on the computer screen. The reality is something different, unexpected, even to the architect who stared at them on his computer screen for the many months leading up to the actual construction. For example, you see swoopy canopies, which were digitally produced, beautifully constructed with individual panels and so on, but they don't keep the wind off. They don't keep the rain off. The scale is wrong for what's around them and what's across the street. And you're very aware that you're looking at something which should only have been seen on a computer screen and never in real life. So that's one issue that I think is a problem. It also seems to me that by its very nature, parametricism prevents you from stumbling on accidents with materials, and perhaps a reaction to parametricism is what we're seeing as a kind of a parallel movement at the moment, although it's a very small scale one, where things like rammed earth, recycled materials, use of techniques that were perhaps considered to be old-fashioned or antique are very attractive to people as an alternative to the parametric blob idea, the sterile computer CNC designed building.
And yet, people are always accusing architects of being somewhat Cartesian. Everything is a box. Anything designed by an architect tends to be a box. And along come a few people that start doing wavy and curvy stuff, and they win the day.
I suppose in the process of designing with this software, which can produce parametric results, the designer is still guided by his or her own intuition about what results should be accepted as final, where you need to go back and change, tweak certain things. As AI becomes more developed and connected to the parametric software, it seems to me that even that step could be removed. I've had no experience using this software. You've played around with it a little bit, I take it. What is your grasp on where this is all leading? Is there a future profession of architecture, or is there not?
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, it's a fantastic tool if you want to design the most energy efficient building I mean, it's great because it'll tell you exactly what, where and what kind of insulating material, and perhaps overhangs, and controlling the amount of sun it receives, and all that sort of stuff. And the amount of water that it uses. Yeah, there's just too many variables for an architect to control 100% of the situation. So,
I'd like to get back to one other aspect of these blobby, curvy buildings, which we haven't really touched on. You mentioned that at the Bilbao Guggenheim, for example, it's quite apparent that every single pane of glass is different. Surely from an economic point of view, from the developer's point of view, to put it crudely, you don't want 500 different panes of glass. You want 500 identical panes of glass. If you're the builder, you don't want to search for number J49. You want to just take the next one out of the stack and install it and carry on. How do these buildings ever get built? It's one thing if they are meant to be public spectacles like the Guggenheim Museum, or perhaps even a church or a stadium or something like that. But for the developer class of buildings, which are the predominant ones being built in our downtowns these days, how does that developer ever get persuaded that using this technique of design is in his interest?
no, the parametrics stay pretty much out of that field. I mean, we're talking about, you're talking about this glass thing. I mean, apart from the Bilbao Museum, there's something called the Shard, again in London. I mean, these cities become almost like a catalog of building shape and use. Dubai is another place where people have gone berserk. Berlin is now an architectural museum. Every well-known architect has some piece there. They they did whatever they thought they were. I don't know what they did. I mean, some took certain things into consideration, others they did. And so I think once you reach a certain plateau of architecture, then the world's your oyster.
But Louis, if you're the client, how are you persuaded that you should be constructing a building which, at first glance, certainly it occurs to you that it's a more expensive type of construction to build than something more conventional? I mean, take the Shard, back to that example. That was Renzo Piano. Was there some step in the process where he had to demonstrate that what he was suggesting was in fact just as economical or not much more expensive than a conventional curtain wall, cubic kind of building, Mies van der Rohe kind of building?
No, I think at some point the client just wants something to show off. It's like your kid that scores a touchdown. Reality goes away in something like that. I mean, to a certain extent. I mean, I've never heard that expression, money, no object. Never heard that. But sometimes you can kind of hear it a little. Everybody's going to look at it. Of course you want that. If you can afford it, you want it. I mean, why do you need a $5 million car? I mean, really, it has nothing to do with the car. That could take anything could take you from A to B. But there are lots of people with lots of money. They just don't know what to do with it, and most of the time it ends up being a building. That's what they want. They want a building. They want to leave a mark. But for the average person, I think that no, the average person, I think wants a building that works, and the architect should be able to provide the best possible building for the amount of money that's given, and for the situation where the building is going, and so on. And this tool will help the person design this building. So I'm all for it. Like everything else, if used correctly. And if not, if the guy's not happy, well, there's always people like you, that can sue the pants off the architect, the builder, and the city while they're at it, for allowing certain monstrosity. But, most of the time, people, they put up with whatever it takes.
I was asking you, going to ask you a second ago about education. It seems to me that it must be very difficult for students to be exposed to these tools where the sky's the limit. They have no actual experience of building or how the translation happens between the computer and the construction site. But reacting to, if you're a professor looking over the work of these students, I would imagine that coming up with a sensible crit of the product is very difficult. You end up criticizing the program as much as the output. I suppose if you're the student, you've got a chance to show that you've got yet another idea which you've used the software to support. But in that inevitable competition from student to student, it must be very more difficult to shine than it used to be when we were in architecture school.
Well, one danger I see is that there's a perception out there by the public that because you're using computers, changes are real easy. And, well, you think you can move this over here a little bit, or could you make this bigger, smaller, higher, taller? And then to extract some fee for performing this work it's excruciatingly painful, because people have this idea that, oh, it's a computer, you just press a few keys and away you go, Well, that's the real danger that exists. And perhaps by calling it artificial intelligence and saying that this will provide you the most energy efficient building, and you can sort of prove or talk about parameters that people understand and are more sensitive to, then you can ask for a larger fee, let's say, and go beyond this idea of how simple it is because you're using a computer. Any idiot could do a building. I mean, you could literally talk your way into making a design. I tried it with ChatGPT recently, and I said, can you please draw me a building, blah, blah, and I gave a whole bunch of parameters and so on. And the thing came back saying, well, at this point, ChatGPT is not able to provide drawings or a picture, So at least I slept easy that.
Well, Louis, this is where I get to say, let's call it a day. interesting conversation, as always. Thank you for it. And we'll do it again next time. Bye for now.
Take care. Bye-bye.